So this session is called Leaving No One Behind, Designing for Inclusion. And we're talking about how from disproportionate job losses to heightened risk of violence, the pandemic has exacerbated violence of all sorts, especially and increased challenges for women, girls, and people from gender and ethnic minorities. So to talk about how we can design in a way that we leave no one behind and how we can make sure that we have that from our design process from the get-go, we are here with this session. I'm going to start by introducing our moderator. Our moderator is Sharmin Islam, who is currently working with UNDP Bangladesh as the gender team leader. In her nearly 15 years of career, she's worked with different national and international organizations at leading positions. I'll pass the floor on to the moderator to introduce the rest of the speakers and start off the session. Hope you love it.
So we are living in a time, in a world with a lot of uncertainties, and our lives here are unsettled. And are these uncertainties very new? I think the audience would agree with me that we also has a lot of sense of insecurity, uncertainties before pandemic as well. But maybe the forms of uncertainties are taking new form. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. And the world has different other crises too. For example, you all know Ukraine war, the record-breaking temperature, the storms, floods, etc. And for the first time ever, the World Human Development Index value has declined for 2 years straight. But the good thing is that many of the crises actually comes with a lot of opportunities as well. And the opportunities to reimagine our future. The opportunities to craft new stories about what we are and what we value. So while reshaping or reimagining our future, we'll have to decide whether we want the same world with a lot of structural inequalities, discrimination, etc., or we want a better world that would be inclusive, that would be just for all. And you all know that leaving no one behind is a central and transformative promise of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. And it reiterates our commitment for eradicating poverty in all its forms, ending discrimination, inequalities, reducing inequalities and vulnerabilities that leave many people behind, and also undermine potentials of individuals and humanity as a whole. So this is very high time to discuss and to find out innovative solutions, innovative approaches for ensuring better inclusion in all our works. For taking this discussion forward, though I was introduced, but once again, I'm Sharmin Islam, working as gender team leader at UNDP Bangladesh. Would like to invite you all, welcome you all, to the panel discussion on leaving no one behind, designing for inclusion. So we have 3 distinguished panelists today to discuss this. So basically, we would try to discuss disproportionate effects and challenges on equality faced by marginalized groups in the global south during the pandemic. We would try to explore different initiatives for inclusion, key learnings from success and failures of those initiatives. And also, we will try to see how to mainstream inclusion, voice of the disadvantaged, and how to update inclusive policies around development and humanitarian crises. So before going into the discussion, I would like to briefly introduce the panelists. We have with us here today Ms. Virali Modi, disability rights activist, a model, a motivational speaker, and an influencer. So welcome, Ms. Virali. We have with us Rani Yanyan, Chakma Rani, Chakma Queen, from Chittagong Hill Tracts. She is Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defender and advisor of the Chakma Circle Chief. And we also have Ms. Heng, Senior Advisor at the Behavioral Insights team. She is joining us online. She is specialized in applying behavioral insights to digital behavior. So first of all, I would like to say that, of course, I could say 100 things about you and your work, our panelists, but I didn't do so because I think the audience would love to hear from you, your lived experiences, and maybe the work that you are doing. And maybe in the next couple of questions, we will try to also unfold what are the challenges that you faced while working for inclusion, etc. So first, I would go to Virali Modi. Would you please introduce yourself a little, more specifically talking about your work. If it is not working, you can also take mine. It's working, okay.
Hello.
Okay, it's working. Great.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Virali Modi. I am from India, and I've worked on countless campaigns of trying to make India more accessible, more disabled friendly, and through my work, modeling, whether it be influencing or motivational speaking, it's been all about creating awareness for people with disabilities and creating a more inclusive community and society. I've been a TEDx speaker. I've been a part of BBC 100 Women in 2017. And all of my work has just been the focus for disability, inclusion, and diversity.
Thank you. I would go to Rani Yanyan.
Aku tuh Riko Baya, Bakunore Mui Juzu Janangor. That's my greetings in my own indigenous languages, two indigenous languages actually. Greetings to all of you and thank you for having me in this panel. I'm Rani Yanyan. As Sharmin Appa has mentioned that I'm Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders. At the same time, I'm an advisor of Chakma Circle. And for many of those who do not know what Chakma Circle is, it's one of the indigenous people's traditional institution, governance institution in Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh. So in many of the indigenous people's communities, we still have been able to retain our own traditional governance system. In many of the nations, statehoods, it's been formally recognized. In many of the countries in the global south, it's not being recognized, but fortunately in Bangladesh, we do have some sort of autonomy for indigenous people's own governance system. So I'm happy to answer all the questions that's in store for us.
Okay, thank you. I would go to Heng Hwee. She has joined us online. Would you please also talk a little bit about what work you are doing?
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be speaking at this panel today. Do stop me if at any point I become unintelligible, sound doesn't cut off quite right or anything like that. So my name is Heng Hwee. I'm a senior advisor of the Behavioural Insights team, and my organization works very much with NGOs and governments to make people's lives better by applying behavioral science. I have a colleague here, I think in Dhaka, who's running a session tomorrow on how to apply behavioral insights. So the details of it, I'll leave to him tomorrow. But for myself, I've worked on a fairly large range of projects in Southeast Asia, mostly in Singapore, Indonesia, and a few other countries around the region. I think two particular projects that might be of interest to this panel session today that I've done in the last 2 years. One would be a project we did in the Maldives to encourage women and girls to pursue STEM careers. And the second one would be a project we did in Singapore to broaden access to labour helplines among migrant domestic workers here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my first question to both Virali and Rani Yanyan. As we were telling that, as we were talking about a lot of also insecurities, even before the COVID pandemic. So we had a lot of structural, inequalities and discrimination, etc., that existed. But then when the COVID started, I mean, we also are facing a lot of new challenges as well. So I would like to know from you that what were the challenges regarding inclusion that existed before? And then also what where the new challenges emerged during COVID-19 crisis regarding inclusion. So first, to Virali.
Thank you. So definitely when it comes towards inclusion, we're talking about inclusion. Again, like inclusion mentions, being included, right? Being included, accessibility, access to certain things like healthcare, medications, food deliveries, all of that wasn't prevalent before the pandemic. Now, one thing that I realized, I live alone in Mumbai. I don't have a caretaker. I don't have house help. I just have house help that comes in maybe just to wash my clothes and help me out with minuscule things. When the pandemic hit, the first lockdown was implemented, I was left stranded. I didn't have anyone to come and help me do my basic things. I mean, suppose like taking a shower, for instance, because as we all know, most houses aren't accessible, especially when you're living on rent. You don't have an option of renovating your house to make it accessible. So I would need someone's help for that. But the lockdown happened, and I remember I felt abandoned. I didn't know what to do. And then I thought, if this is my situation, what about other people, suppose the elderly, who have a difficult time getting up, or who have a difficult time with their mobility? Or what about parents who have disabled children? What are they going to do about this? So I started a campaign, I started a petition to the Home Ministry called #DisabilityOnLockdown. So caretakers were not considered essential services. I mean, essential services were like pharmacies, hospitals, doctors, but not caretakers. So what about this marginalized group? Why should they feel abandoned? We started that petition, and thankfully it shot up, and we petitioned the Home Ministry to recognize caretakers as essential services. That law got passed, and we were able to make that happen, to make that a reality. During the second lockdown, that wasn't a problem. Everyone had the help that they needed. And again, talking about inclusion, after the pandemic, grocery delivery services. I don't need to step out of my home for anything. Medicines are right to my door. We have online consultation with doctors. Everything is much more accessible. And I think that is the definition of inclusion.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, of course, we all have certain disabilities, or we are differently able. But then, of course, during lockdown, even the people we actually perceive as normal, we also face a lot of challenges, like what the issues that you are telling, that having the groceries and doing the works by ourselves, etc. But then, of course, you raised a very important issue, and even you did a petition, so that's really brave. Then I would go to Rani Yanyan. If you want to add something, like what were the challenges before pandemic and after pandemic?
I think I'll completely agree with Virali here, is that all the challenges in terms of inclusion challenges, those challenges were there before COVID pandemic, and what pandemic has shown us that how entrenched the inequality is, how entrenched the non-inclusion bit in our society. If I talk about indigenous peoples, that it has been a structural marginalization of indigenous peoples, not only in Bangladesh, I'm talking about Global South, and also in different parts of the world. And that structural discrimination, it ranges from, since indigenous peoples live in natural resource-rich areas, because indigenous peoples are the custodians of, forests, jungles. If you try to figure out where indigenous peoples live, if we map them out, you will always see that they live in forests, they live in jungles, they live in nature, they live with nature. So these peoples have been marginalized for centuries, and with the modern statehood, the democracy we talk about, which eventually talks about majority rules, we do not try to include indigenous peoples, marginalized peoples' voices. So these indigenous peoples, during COVID pandemic, we have seen how the extent of marginalization in terms of healthcare facilities. In many of the remote areas, they either have no access to healthcare facilities or have limited access to healthcare facilities. And in some cases, those, those who want to seek services from those healthcare facilities, they are being discriminated because they are of indigenous origin, and also the food security issue. And when I'm talking about food security issue, it's not the challenge that only indigenous peoples faced, it's the challenge that everyone, especially from lower income families, they face. But indigenous peoples have always been very self-reliant, because they always practiced subsistence economy within their communities. But the fact that with modernization, indigenous people have been forced to incorporate with market. They have to rely on market right now. So with the lockdown, they were not being able to access the market. So that food insecurity, they do not have enough food in their homes, which is unprecedented, which was unprecedented. So these are some of the challenges. And we also think that after the post-pandemic, we are thinking about going back to, slow food movement. We are going back to roots. The basic needs, thinking how we can cultivate our own food, how we can sustain our own families. We can learn a lot from indigenous peoples if we give an ear to them, if we listen to them, how they have been doing it for centuries, and what has made them change their way of life in this modern world.
Okay, what about the indigenous women? Because we know that during lockdown, violence against women, especially at the domestic sphere, has increased. So what about, like, as an indigenous women, of course, they face discrimination because of their multiple and intersectional identities. So what about during the lockdown period? Were the situation of women the same as you were talking about the indigenous people? But what about the women?
I think for women in general during lockdown, women in general, they faced more violence for multiple reasons. And it is no different in indigenous communities as well. But at the same time, we need to think, where can people go to redress that issue? So even before lockdown, if indigenous women faced any violence perpetrated by, whether that's an outsider, non-indigenous person, or whether that's perpetrated by an indigenous person, where can they go? Do they have that facility? Can they go to the police station and talk about it? Can they speak in their own language? Can they make that law enforcement officers understand where they're coming from? So these things need to be taken into account. Whether we have those systems in place where indigenous women, not only indigenous women, women in general, they can feel safe when they talk about violence. And I'm talking about any sort of violence. May that be domestic violence, may that be sexual violence perpetrated by others. But At the end of the day, we need to think about the facilities we have, whether those facilities provide context-specific needs, they address the context-specific needs for any group of population.
Is there any data or any research that has been done which shows that there is also increase of violence in the indigenous community on women as well? I'm not sure. I'm just asking whether there is any data that you know and you want to share with the audience.
I think there's one organization that produced they documented the cases of violence perpetrated against indigenous women. I don't have it at hand right now, but if anyone is interested, they can contact me directly.
Yeah, sure. So we'll move to the next question, and I will come to Virali, to you first, and then again, maybe if Didi wants to add anything, but mainly to Virali, that how inclusive are the current processes and methods of designing solutions and innovations? And do we engage enough voices of the marginalized in our design process? What is your experience? Whether we really try to include marginalized people when we design any initiative? This is one. And the next one is how we can better incorporate the voices and insights in building relevant, realistic, and effective inclusive solutions.
This is a great question, actually. You know, when I started my petitions, the one thing that I realized is marginalized communities don't really have a voice. And it's a shame in a way. Definitely it's a shame. Rather, when we're talking about policies, we're talking about raising our voices, people tend to go to Twitter. They tend to raise their voice on Twitter or social media. But a lot of people from marginalized communities don't have access to that. So talking about digital, we need to maybe up our game in digital. We need to have a voice when we're creating policies. Within the government, I know for a fact that, are there people with disabilities? Are there people with disabilities in the government in India? I haven't seen anyone. So why are they allowing policies to be built when there isn't someone with a disability? Our needs are more different. I mean, disability is an umbrella term. Everyone's needs are different. So we have a special sector for disabilities, but not all of our needs are being met. And I think that's what needs to change. Right now, definitely, because digital is a huge medium, people are raising their voices, but are our voices actually going across? That's my biggest question.
So Didi, if you want to add, like, what about Bangladesh? Like, for example, when we are formulating any policies or reviewing the policies or in the decision making or even in the development sector when we are designing our initiatives, etc. So do you think that we also consider including the marginalized people so that their concerns are well met?
Taking into consideration.
Taking into consideration.
Yeah, that's one of the points I think I need to make, that having access is not as same as having been included in the process. So in most of the cases, and I won't single out Bangladesh, it is the reality of the Global South for all the indigenous peoples groups, or most of the indigenous peoples communities, is that when governments are right now willing to provide indigenous peoples access to the platform, but they are not including them within the system. So what happens is that if there's a, say, if I take an example of climate change action, say UNRED, since you are from UN, UNRED, so indigenous peoples will be invited to attend different discussion sessions, consultation sessions, but they will be invited in last minute, so 2 or 3 days time, and you don't get enough time to prepare what you are going to speak about in that discussion session. And those indigenous rights activists, those right defenders, they don't want to speak about their own personal viewpoints. They want to speak about the community. They need to have enough time to consult with the communities. Do they get that time? They don't get that time. And in indigenous communities, I really need to stress this point, and I think many people do not understand the concept of the collective right, because when we think about rights, we talk about individual rights. We don't think about collective rights, and for indigenous peoples, collective right is as important as indigenous rights. So we don't talk about what I believe. We don't talk about what we believe. We talk about what we believe. So we need to have that amount of time to consult with our communities, to consult with all the beneficiaries, what we are going to, what points we want to put across in any consultation sessions. But we are not given that time. So yes, access is important. I think that's the starting point. But you need to include, effectively and efficiently include indigenous peoples, and you have to make that space.
While listening to you, when you were talking about collective rights, just one question popped up in my mind. That when we are talking about indigenous rights in Bangladesh, then mostly we think about the people who are living in the Chittagong hill tracts. But there are many indigenous people in Bangladesh who are living in the plain land.
Exactly.
So it would be really nice to also hear from you, as you are indigenous people's human rights defender. So what actually, what are the focuses that you have to also think of the marginalized, the most marginalized within the marginalized people? So can you please reflect on it?
Yes. Okay. Since we are talking about inclusion issues, even in Chittagong Hill Tracts, even in the hills, we have 11 indigenous peoples groups, and we have numerically very small indigenous peoples communities, as small as 3,000 people that constitute one indigenous peoples community. And also you talked about indigenous peoples communities living in the plains. So we have a network of our indigenous peoples within Bangladesh. We are working with our regional and global networks of indigenous peoples communities. And yes, Chittagong Hill Tracts issue comes way forward in many of the platforms because we have more voices, and since we have our own traditional institution, we are more empowered than the indigenous peoples living in the plains. But we try to put their challenges forward, but at the same time, we want them to have that space as well. We try our best. Sometimes, you know the challenges in development field, the space, to claiming that space. So we are empowering our indigenous people's counterparts from different parts of Bangladesh. At the same time, we want them to speak for themselves.
Okay, thank you. So for a long time, actually, we are not hearing from Ko. Sorry for that. So now I would like to come to you with my next question. But of course, you can answer the first two questions if you would like to. So my specific question to you is, what were some, yeah, of course, Ko is working in a sector which is actually not, I'm not that familiar. And I have, of course, heard about the nudging theory and a little bit read about it. But it would be really nice to hear from you that while outlining an intervention for inclusion during pandemic, how did you apply behavioral nudges and design practice in the design practices? I mean, am I clear, Ko?
Yeah, of course. And I hope you don't mind, because I think what Ms. Virali and Ms. Rani said about this difficulty with getting included in this co-design process when policymakers are designing policies or service designers are coming up, right, with all these services that are supposed to serve everybody and not just the most successful people, is that good co-design is really hard, right? Because I mean, having worked with people on the other side of the aisle, I think can be very tempting to kind of get feedback from the people who it's most easy, or who are most accessible to them. This can be people who are, easy to travel to in the capital. Online, it's a lot easier than if you have to travel to remote areas in various parts of the country. And there is a very strong temptation, I think, to call it a day and say, well, we've designed this and hopefully it works and we'll try and fix it along the way. Right. But the question really is, in order to design good services, it's really important for us to include the voices of the people who will be using it. And that means of everybody who will be using it, not just those people who come first to mind or easiest to get in touch with. So this was one of the things that was really important to us when we were designing an intervention to encourage girls in the Maldives to pick up more STEM subjects, to pursue STEM careers. Because for context, for those who are not so familiar with the Maldives is quite has quite a traditional culture, and a lot of girls actually drop out after their O-levels, their exams at 16 years old, because further education often means that they have to kind of leave their home island, they have to travel further away from their family, and it's often not a very comfortable experience for lots of people involved. So, I mean, I think a very typical easy way out would have been to prototype and trial within the capital, because that's where a lot of people are. But we actually made the effort to kind of prototype with as many different schools in different islands, in different regions as possible, because it was important for us to understand, does this intervention work for the entire country, not just for the people who already have the most access to the services they need. So what we were trialing, and I'll share my screen in a little bit just because I think pictures make it much easier to understand. What we were trialing was what we call a role modeling intervention. And the idea is that because for a lot of girls, they basically had no female role models, right, who pursued careers in science, technology, engineering, or maths. All their mothers, their aunts, their sisters, most of them would drop out of school after O-levels, and then they will be housewives, or they might take a diploma somewhere near their home and then become a school teacher. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to introduce role models, women from the Maldives who worked in science, technology, engineering, and maths, to schoolgirls around the country. So what we did was we prototyped this talk a few times in different regions. We prototyped it in Malé, the capital. We prototyped it in North Maldives, where there's like lots of islands, which is also very distinct regionally and culturally from South Maldives, which is where I think most people have the typical images of Maldives and diving and coral reefs. And so you'll see that what we did was that we dialed into what would happen was that this would be a online talk, and we would dial in, and it would be us, a bit like what I'm doing now, standing or sitting in front of a room full of people talking, and this was in classrooms. And the really interesting thing is that as you talk to people and prototype, you get lots and lots of different feedback, right? This picture here at the bottom. At first, it was just, a bit of a question and answer session. What do you love most about your job? Can you tell me a little bit about what you were like when you were younger, when you were 16 years old? And then as the sessions went on, they were like, oh, it'll be actually really interesting if we could try out what being in science, technology, engineering, or math means. And that led to us including this coding activity here that the girls had a lot of fun with, right? And I think that really increased their engagement, because they said, and all this came about because we were really intentional in getting feedback from them about what would make this more useful for you, what really engaged you. And on the topic of feedback, right, like it's easy to give something to someone and say, so tell me what you think. But that's a little bit lazy, right? Like it's really important for us to be intentional about the kinds of questions that we want to ask, because that's the real way that we are going to be able to make space for people to talk about the things that are important to them. So a couple of examples of questions that we asked girls during these prototyping sessions. On the left side, what you see is questions basically, what part of this talk surprised you the most? And the reason we asked that, because we know as behavioral scientists, as psychologists, that what you remember tends to be what you're most surprised by. If you ever have to make a pitch to someone, or you ever have to make someone remember you, here's my pro tip to you: surprise them with something. And you get quite good results, right? And we asked this question because we wanted to know, what was it that was sticking with girls, and was it what we wanted? The responses that we got from them was did help to validate that we were on the right track, because we did want, like, our hypothesis was that girls had no role models on how to pursue STEM, and having someone tell us it's the first time that she saw a woman doing science, engineering, technology, that really validated our hypothesis. On the right side, this is a slightly different kind of question, and that being able to ask that question really depends on understanding what are the influences, right, that girls navigate when they're deciding what to do after their exams. And one really big one is their parents. If their parents, the short answer of it is, if their parents don't support them to leave their hometown, leave their home island to pursue further studies, then nothing is going to happen. So which is why it was really important for us to ask the girls, pretend you are your parent. What questions do you think they will ask you in response? And it's a lot of really practical, really important things that girls would think about. These are not screenshots because they were translated from Behavioural, right? And the important thing, so what we found out from that was, things like, is it stable? Like, parents understandably care very much about whether, if their girl is going to do something weird and unknown, is it actually a good prospect for them? And also there is this thing about breaking down barriers, breaking down stereotypes, that girls can succeed in this field as well, and not just boys. So that's my small little bit of input on using behavioral insights and co-designing well with as much of your population that you're working with as possible.
Yeah, thank you, Ko. I think we have also learned the innovative approach and what we can also do here. And I think we are also prototyping many initiatives since the COVID has started, how we can do things in a new way. But I will come to also Rani, Yanyan, to you, if you want to also take this question. If you can share a few examples or cases would be good.
Okay, what we learned from COVID pandemic, what innovations and solutions we have learned from COVID pandemic is that, yes, obviously I'll be speaking from my own experience, is that, in Bangladesh, public health sector is quite weak, and sometimes it can be termed as dysfunctional, not always, sometimes. But besides that, no government was ready to tackle such a pandemic. No government in this entire world was ready to tackle this pandemic. But what Bangladesh government did at that time was to raise awareness about, hand washing, hygiene practices. So with every phone call you receive or you give a phone call, you get that message that you have to wash your hands, you have to maintain social distancing and everything. So that part was taken care of. You're raising awareness among general public, including in indigenous peoples who are living in remote areas but who have access to mobile phones. But how do we ensure that those people can practice those, hygiene regimes? because those people don't have access to adequate water. Those people don't have access to running water. So what we did from civil society is that since we found that gap, within a week, we researched and we found out a solution from the net, an innovation that was supported by World Health Organization. It's called Tippy Tap, a very simple device. It only costs you 100 taka to install it if you have those materials in hand, or you can just buy that product with 100 taka. So it's a low-cost solution so that not only indigenous peoples, but marginalized people who do not have access to adequate water, they can practice those hand-washing regimes to minimize the spread of coronavirus. And we made a short documentary in a few days, and we jointly flooded our social media outlets with the documentary. And at the same time, we effectively used our network, our very institutionalized indigenous traditional leaders network, traditional leaders, village chiefs who are living in the villages. We communicated with them. We have shown them how to install that water supply device. And also we mobilized our youth organizations. So in another 1 week, one of the development organizations that were working in the hills, funded by USAID, they picked it up and they started to promote it in one of the districts through hundreds of community health workers. And then what happened, which we actually did not think that it's going to happen, but it did happen, that Chittagong Development Board, they promoted it in their Parakendro, so community centers managed by the development board, in hundreds of community centers in the villages in Chittagong Hill Tracts. So I know that this intervention did not follow the conventional public-private partnership model, but in a grave situation, it actually worked. The lesson that we can learn, is that if indigenous people's insights into the challenges, the ground realities can be incorporated, then effective, efficient, and very quick solutions can be built, and it's going to help the communities. And do I have time? Because I want to.
Yeah, just quickly.
Okay,
Maybe.
2 minutes. Because I really want to talk about another experience during COVID pandemic, which I think will have, we need to think about that insight as well. In Bangladesh, I think the second week of March, Bangladesh reported its first case of COVID-19. And by the 4th week of March, indigenous peoples' communities, villages in the hills and in the plains, they started to isolate themselves. They imposed upon themselves voluntary lockdown, while our law enforcement agencies and military was struggling to enforce lockdown in different parts of Bangladesh. We have our own quarantine system. We know how to deal with epidemics. And that is traditional knowledge. That is indigenous traditional knowledge that we have been practicing for centuries. The very fact that indigenous traditional knowledge is not given any value whatsoever, it's not recognized, let alone being celebrated. But some of the key answers, some of the key solutions can be found in those traditional knowledges if we have the ear to listen to it, if we tap into those traditional knowledges. And I do not even want to start talking about indigenous traditional knowledge regarding conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem, of natural farming, of natural resource management. But we need to think about different ways to include marginalized people, especially since I'm talking about indigenous people, of indigenous peoples who have a rich and very relevant knowledges that won't only address the challenges they face in their day-to-day life, but also can solve some of the global challenges like climate change issues.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a really great example. Sometimes we think that we know everything and then impose many things, design in our own way, but actually we need to really understand the specific needs, and not only needs, priorities of people on the ground. So of course this is a very good example, and to Virali, we also know that you worked for disability-friendly infrastructure and also fought for disabled-friendly measures in Indian Railway. So very, very quickly, if you can say, what are the innovative ways or strategies that you followed so that people really hear you, I mean, especially the people in the decision-making level?
Well, first of all, I remember giving a talk and I told them to close their eyes, to imagine themselves on a wheelchair, and to think how difficult it would be to climb the stairs into the train. Now, the harsh truth is that I was molested while getting into the train by the porters. So I made them imagine that. And that's when I said, if you can't even imagine that happening to you, I lived through that. Many people lived through that. So this change needs to happen. And all we did was we implemented portable ramps with brakes on them and small aisle-sized wheelchairs which you can find in planes. We created them, and across 9 stations in India, they're totally wheelchair accessible without any renovations whatsoever. So it's just simple things, it's just innovative ideas can create a huge change. It can really make a difference.
Okay, thank you once again. So my last question to all the panelists, I'm not seeing any question from the audience yet. Is there any question from the audience? Well, if not, there are? Okay. Okay, the panelists can also take any specific question, but I think there are several questions. Seems like the debate of inclusion remains between government, CSOs and activists. What role can private sector play in shaping mindsets towards inclusion? To Virali, there is one specific question. In the inclusion space, what are some of the policy decisions by the governments that made sense for you, which created some positive impact?
Can I just take that
yes,
question?
Please.
Honestly, nothing. I mean, none of the policies make any sense to me. Talking about the Wheelchair Accessible India campaign, what facilities are there in India? There really aren't any. I mean, it's been mandatory now that ramps and accessible features are mandatory by the government. But you can't see any implementation on the ground level. So that kind of just, I mean, it puts me off in the wrong way. So how do we go about that? And I think clubbing that with the first question, private sectors, start raising your voices. I mean, just to people, everyone here, start raising your voices. If you are in the private sector, you have a business, your home is there, start making it accessible, renovations. I mean, ultimately, and this is again another harsh truth, everyone is temporarily abled. One day or the other, you're gonna need to use a wheelchair, crutches, or a walker. And at that point of time, when you can't even access your own home, how do you go about that? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's, I mean, as soon as we realize this, would be better for us. Anyway, so can we take a look, the last questions, 2 questions? Okay. So the next question is to Ko. If seeing is believing, then what kind of easy behavioral nudges make sense for building inclusion? First, communities in the global south. Examples, so with an example. Ko, are you there?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, right? I think because we usually say that you can't really just blanket apply any old behavioral nudge you like to any old community, because it's really important to understand the context of who you're working with and the communities that you're working with in order to apply the right nudge that works on the right mechanisms. Having said that, I think one intervention, one nudge that has worked really well for us during the COVID-19 pandemic was what we call the community mandate, which is a bit of a community version of a social norm. So social norms are a bit infamous among behavioral nudges. They're like, I think they were, if you've heard of the tax trial before, it's like 7 out of 10 of your neighbors in this district pay tax. Please make sure you pay your tax on time. People have used it all over the place. 80% of people don't smoke, please don't smoke, these kinds of things. A community nudge, on the other hand, is slightly different in the sense that we use this in Indonesia in villages where what we wanted people to do basically was to use hand washing stations, wash their hands in public places so that you reduce viral transmission and improve general hygiene in the area. So what we did was we implemented a community mandate where the people who were just kind of like generally responsible for the area would tell people who use these public facilities, hi, before you enter the mosque, before you enter this community hall, can you please wash your hands first before you come in, so that we keep everybody in our community safe. And the reason why this works and is actually really, really sustainable is because these people who are delivering these messages, firstly, they are people of authority within the community as well as within the context in which they're asking, right? So if you're a shop owner and you ask someone to wash their hands before they enter your shop, you're perfectly within your rights and people expect you to do that. So it's easy for them to do. And the nice thing is that these are people who are already there. You're not paying someone to be next to a hand washing station, right? Because if you're an imam at a mosque, you were already there and you're quite used to telling people, please do this, please do that, and make sure that you follow all the right protocols before you enter. So that worked really well. We tried that in a bunch of villages working with Nadatul Ulama in Indonesia, and we found that people were much more likely to use the public hand washing stations to wash their hands in villages which had implemented this community mandate than in villages which had not. So that's one example of a behavioral nudge that I think would classify as easy because it's really, really sustainable and just needs buy-in from your community. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that it would be applicable everywhere because it really depends on your community dynamics.
Okay, thanks, Ko. So I think we don't have time, but quickly, just one question to all the panelists. Very briefly, share with us what gives you hope for the post-pandemic world. Very briefly.
Solidarity, honestly. I think everyone coming together, supporting people, supporting everyone, I think that's what gives me hope.
Same question. Yeah, I think what gives me hope is that at least now development sector is taking the issue of inclusion more seriously than ever in the post-pandemic world. Before, it was a reality, but still it was not taken that seriously. It was not been focused that much. So that gives me hope that we can actually work towards including marginalized people, including indigenous peoples.
Ko?
In a similar vein, I think seeing private individuals, companies really step up during the pandemic to help people who were in need at that time really gives me hope because that also, with more people stepping up, more people representing their communities, that gives us more chances and more opportunities to address everyone's needs.
Thank you so much. I think people are very hungry at this moment. So we shouldn't continue. We should stop here. So I would like to thank our panelists for contributing to this discussion. I think we are in the middle of the discussion, so it should go on. And we have learned many innovative approaches, strategies that we can take forward. And thank you so much once again, Ko. Thank you that you joined, at least online. It could be nice to also have you here, but at least you joined online. Thanks for that. And thanks, audience, for your patient participation. Thank you.